Hi, everyone. As Luan said, won't you turn to Nehemiah chapter 1, and I'm going to be reading up till chapter 2, verse 10. Hear these words. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burnt with fire." When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, "Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, 'If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man." I was cupbearer to the king. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "What is it you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy." And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. This is God's word.
Thank you, Alan. Evening, everyone. Welcome from my side. Let me pray and then we can get into this passage. Father, please would you fill us with a knowledge of your will and of who you are this evening. Please help us to see the glory of your plan for the world that's revealed to us here in the book of Nehemiah and ultimately in your Son, Jesus. And we ask this in his precious name. Amen. What does it take to make someone uproot their whole life and to give it all up for the sake of God's kingdom? Does it take a little bit of insanity? Some people would say so. But I want to suggest to you and show you from Nehemiah that what is really needed is a radical trust in God's promises and in the character of the God who makes those promises. Let's dive in and you can see for yourself. At first, a very, very quick recap. We've just finished with the book of Ezra, which is, they go together. And in it, we were introduced to two leaders, Zerubbabel and Ezra. And what you need to know about them is they were instrumental in leading God's people when the Persian king allowed them to return to Jerusalem and to restore God's temple. It was hard going, but at least they were back in the land. They were in the land of promise where they were supposed to be, and that gave us hope. Well, we fast forward a few years, and then we get to meet the third instrumental leader during this period, and that is Nehemiah. And his journey begins with what I've called bad news from home. Right away in chapter 1, we're introduced to Nehemiah. He is a Jewish man living in Susa. It's a city in the Persian Empire where the king had his summer palace. And at first, we're not actually sure what he's doing there. It's been roughly 70 years since the Persians allowed Jews to go back to the city of Jerusalem, back to the promised land, that place that is so intimately tied up with God's promises. So why would you not return to the land if you had the opportunity to do so? That's a question in our minds. But it immediately becomes clear that although Nehemiah is living in the heart of the Persian Empire, his heart is with his people back home. We see this when Hanani and some others come from Judah, and Nehemiah wastes no time in asking them, what's going on in Jerusalem? How are the people doing? How are they? They've made this momentous decision to uproot their lives in Persia and to go back home. To his dismay, the news he gets is not good. The returnees from exile are in a bad way. They are disgraced and vulnerable because the once robust fortifications of the city of Jerusalem lie in ruins. And the news is almost too much for Nehemiah. He breaks down. He weeps for his brothers and sisters back home. And after the initial shock of it, he responds by mourning and fasting and praying. And we get a glimpse of his prayer. We hear his words as he prays to the God of heaven in earnest in chapter 1. And what's apparent as he prays is that he's under no illusions as to why they're in the situation they're in. He knows this is the result of God's judgment. God promised his people that if they were unfaithful to him, this would happen. And they were unfaithful to him. They have betrayed the God who has been nothing but loving and faithful towards them. But all hope is not lost in spite of God's judgment for Nehemiah, because he knows the God he's dealing with. In fact, that is the starting point of his prayer. Have a look at verse 5. He says, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes opened to hear the prayer of your servant is praying before you day and night. So the basis for bothering to pray is that he knows he's dealing with a God who is both powerful and faithful. He is the Lord, his covenant name. He's made a covenant with his people. He's in relationship with them. But that fact alone is actually no guarantee that God will listen to his prayer. After all, Nehemiah says himself that it is with those who love him and who keep his commandments that God keeps his covenant of love. That's not any way you can describe Israel. So what hope is there? Well, only the hope that God himself provides. And you have to read on in his prayer to see that. Have a look from verse 8. He says, remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the furthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. You see, God in his grace has made provision for exactly this situation. And so as Nehemiah prays, he has all the reason in the world to trust that God will hear his prayer and answer it. That's the very thing he's promised to do. Now, it's worth saying at this point that this is as true today as it was in Nehemiah's day. You see, prayer isn't a magical formula which you can use to get whatever you want. It is a means by which God gives the things he has promised to his people as they have need and as they ask him for them, as they depend on him for them. So if I pray, Lord, please make me a billionaire so that I can buy a beach house and buy a jet ski and just live my life in luxury, chances are good that he's not going to answer that yes. Not because he can't, but because that's a misuse of prayer. That's not what it's there for. You see, he has given us prayer as a means to lay hold of his good promises to his people. But if, for example, I were to pray in a situation where I need wisdom to make a godly decision because I've fallen on hard times, then I'm standing on more solid ground suddenly, because one of the things God has promised is he will give wisdom to his people without finding fault if they just ask him for it. You see how there's a big difference between those two prayers? You see, Nehemiah knows this fact about prayer, and so it's on this basis, on the basis of God's own promises, and with humble confession, that he makes his plea. Have a look from verse 11. He says, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king. Here we finally understand why Nehemiah is still in Susa rather than back home with his people. He holds an important role. He has an important job for the king of the empire of Persia. It's not the kind of job you can just walk away from. So as much as his heart is with his people, and as much as he is heartbroken by the news he's heard from back home, there is a very real, practical barrier to his ability to actually do anything about it. He has responsibilities here in Susa. He has a job where he can't just put in leave and it be granted to him. He is directly answerable to the king. And so with that in mind, he prays. And it's clear that Nehemiah understands that while this is a very real barrier, it's no obstacle to God. We see this in the language he uses as he prays there. He uses the word Lord for God, where the king is simply this man. Although the king of Persia has power over Nehemiah, at the end of the day, he's just a man. And Nehemiah's God is the Lord, the God of heaven, who does whatever he pleases. So before he does anything, Nehemiah prays to this God. He asks him to grant him favor before this man, who from a worldly perspective holds all the power. This brings us to our second key moment in the story, the plan to return. We're alerted at the start of chapter 2 that it's the month of Nisan, which means 4 months have gone by since Nehemiah initially got the news of what's going on back home. Now, at last, he gets a chance to come to the king with the request that has been burdening his heart for these months. And clearly, the distress of the news has taken its toll on him, so that it's actually King Artaxerxes who makes the first move. The king sees the change in his trusty cupbearer. Nehemiah's sadness is so great that it's had a physical effect on his body. It's evident from the outside. And so the king asks, "What's up? Why are you so sad?" It seems like genuine concern, and yet Nehemiah is terrified when he asks that question. Now, that might seem like an overreaction until we realize what's at stake here. For one thing, the kings in Persia have a reputation for being quite fickle, and so if he's not happy that Nehemiah is being a killjoy when he's just trying to enjoy a nice glass of wine, who knows what might happen? But there's something that actually elevates the stakes far more than that. And we know this. The thing that we know as Nehemiah goes into this, we know what the real answer is to this question, right? He's upset because of the state of Jerusalem, of his people back home. But this isn't as simple a thing to bring up before the king as we might think. You see, the reason is found in chapter 4 of Ezra, which is a summary of all of the opposition to God's people during this period of history. And it turns out that somewhere early on in Artaxerxes' reign, enemies of the Jews wrote a letter to the king. And what they wrote was a request to put an end to the renovation project in Jerusalem, to put an end to the building up of that city. And the thing about that letter is that it was successful. Their letter had its intended effect. Have a look at his reply to that letter in Ezra 4. It'll be on the screen. Ezra 4 from the end of verse 17. The king writes, "Greetings. The letter you sent us has been read and translated in my presence. I issued an order and a search was made, and it was found that this city, Jerusalem, has a long history of revolt against kings and has been a place of rebellion and sedition. Jerusalem has had powerful kings ruling over the whole of Trans-Euphrates, and taxes, tribute, and duty were paid to them. Now, issue an order to these men to stop work so that the city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let this threat grow to the detriment of the royal interests?" King Artaxerxes personally put a stop to the rebuilding of Jerusalem years earlier. And when we realize this, all of a sudden the precariousness of Nehemiah's position becomes clear. It's no wonder he is terrified. And yet he steels himself and he answers boldly in verse 3 of chapter 2. He says, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" He goes for it. He says, "You want to know? Well, here's the reason. The city of my family lies in ruins and it's vulnerable to more devastation. How can I be anything but sad?" And what follows this passionate plea is incredible. This Persian king with a mighty empire is moved and he asks Nehemiah, "What would you like me to do about it?" And now Nehemiah is sensible enough to know that God is at work here. And so before he answers the king, he prays again to the God who has gotten him thus far. And his list of things that he asks the king to do is quite significant. He asks for time off to go and rebuild the city. He wisely avoids the name Jerusalem throughout the section, actually. And he also asks the king for some official letters, some to keep anyone from hindering him on his journey, and also one to take to the guy who's in charge of the royal wood supply so he can have some good timber to do the work of rebuilding. And verse 8 tells us, "Because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests." You see, God is behind this plan of Nehemiah's, and he is orchestrating things so that everything is falling into place just right. And so Nehemiah heads off on his mission to his homeland, along with officers and an army, with army officers and cavalry in tow that the king sent without him asking for them. It must have felt like a great success. It must have felt like nothing could stop him. He's God's man on God's mission. All that's left to do is to get to Jerusalem and start building. But verse 11 tips us off that things might not be as easy as they first seem. You see, it turns out there are some powerful enemies, people in this region who aren't happy that Nehemiah is coming back to help. And that takes us to our third key moment in the story. Work gets underway. We're about to get into stuff that wasn't a part of what was read, and so I'm going to read the next section for us, so it'll help if you have your Bible open. Please follow with me from chapter 2, verse 11, and we'll read into a part of chapter 3. "I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night, I went out through the valley gate towards the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem which had been broken down and its gates which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on towards the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, 'You see the trouble we are in? Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you are doing? They asked. Are you rebelling against the king? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. They dedicated it and set its doors in place, building as far as the Tower of the 100, which they dedicated, and as far as the Tower of Hananel. The men of Jericho built the adjoining section, and Zakur, son of Imri, built next to them. The fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of Hassanah. They laid its beams and put its doors and bolts and bars in place. Meremoth, son of Uriah, the son of Hakkoz, repaired the next section. Next to him, Meshullam, son of Berechiah, the son of Meshezabel, made repairs, and next to him, Zadok, son of Baana, also made repairs. The next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. Jump ahead to verse 8. Uzziel, son of Harhiah, one of the goldsmiths, repaired the next section, and Hananiah, one of the perfume makers, made repairs next to that. They restored Jerusalem as far as the broad wall. And then on to verse 12. Shallum, son of Halohesh, ruler of the half district of Jerusalem, repaired the next section with the help of his daughters. So Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem, and 3 days later he embarks on a secret scouting mission under the cover of darkness in order to assess what needs to happen next. He's careful not to let anyone in on his plans too soon because he knows there are enemies about. There are people who would love nothing more than to see them continue in their state of shame. And after assessing the situation, Nehemiah wastes no time in rallying the people into action. He tells them the plan to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and how God has graciously been opening the way for him every step of the journey so far. And their response is an immediate one. They say, let us start rebuilding. When the enemies hear the plan, there is some ridicule and pushback. But Nehemiah responds with confidence that God has given them success, and so they get to work. And this work is what chapter 3 is all about, right? It's a detailed account of who built and what they built. And I know it's quite hard going to read that. I just wanted to give you a sense of what chapter 3 is like. There's a lot more that I could have read. And when we get to parts of the Bible like that, sometimes we don't really know what to do with it. Why is it in there? And as I was reflecting on why we need all these names and all this detail, I couldn't help but think about it in terms of the classic children's show, Bob the Builder. Has anyone here seen Bob the Builder? Okay. Oh, not so many. It's disappointing. I watched a few as a child, especially my brother really loved it. I endured it. But there's one thing about Bob the Builder that I don't think I will ever forget, and that's the theme song. You're not going to enjoy this, but here's how it goes. So it goes, Bob the Builder, can we fix it? Bob the Builder, yes we can. Scoop, Muck and Dizzy and Rolly too. Lofty and Wendy, join the crew. Bob and the gang have so much fun. Working together, they get the job done. Thank you. Now, do you see why that song is relevant here? You see, in chapter 2, we have Nehemiah the builder calling to his countrymen, can we fix it? And they answer, yes, we can. And then in chapter 3, we get to the action. Let's get this. Eliashib, Meremoth, and Meshullam too. Shallum and his daughters join the crew. Nehemiah and the gang have so much fun. Working together, they get the job done. Right? Now, I grant you it's a silly example, but in terms of what chapter 3 is all about, it hits the nail on the head. We have this detailed chapter, and it's a beautiful picture of God's people working together, rebuilding Jerusalem, the city of David. Remember, Jerusalem is the hotspot of God's covenant promises, and so we should be excited when we see his people working on the city that's been left in ruin. They're trying to repair the hopes of their nation. Their work shows that they're actually on board not only with the plans for their nation, but with God's plans to bless the whole world. This is an expression of their trust in his promises. So great is their faith that they are moved to action. And part of what makes it so exciting, yes, chapter 3 is very exciting, is who it is that gets stuck into the work. We have the high priest, we have goldsmiths, we have perfume makers and city rulers, one of whose daughters his daughters all help out too. And all these people, from the wealthy to the poor, are working side by side because of their hope in God's promises. And as they trust him, God is working behind the scenes to make it all possible. You see, it's a wonderful thing when God's people work for the kingdom side by side. It's wonderful to read about it in Israel's history, and it's really wonderful to see it in our world when Christ's body functions as it should, when people work hard for the sake of the kingdom. This is how God's people are meant to operate, working together for the kingdom. But that's also why the nobles of Tekoa stand out like a sore thumb in verse 5, as they refuse to stoop and join in the hard work. They are a blemish on an otherwise wonderful scene. They seem to think they are above it. This work isn't for them. This is for the others. You see, they haven't bought into God's promises. We know that because if they had, they wouldn't hesitate to pour everything they have into the work of building his kingdom. It's work that God is clearly behind. This is a good litmus test for us too, by the way. Have you bought into God's promises? And if you say yes, does your life, where you spend your time, your energy, and your money, reflect this? See, the thing is, your life will only ever reflect this if you trust in his promises, and if you really do trust the God who made these promises, believing he will make good on them. You'll only be able to pour all you have into the kingdom, like Nehemiah and those whose names are recorded here, if you believe that he will build his kingdom and that the gates of hell will not stand against it. The fact is, God will build his kingdom, whether you or I believe it. Nehemiah took him at his word, and in God's strength, he led the people in rebuilding Jerusalem, the city where God's promise of salvation was to be found, the city where God's promised king would reign. How striking it is, then, to see the reaction of the promised king years later when he came to the rebuilt, restored Jerusalem. He entered the city not with an armed guard, but riding on a donkey. But like Nehemiah, he inspected it for himself before taking action. And the Jerusalem he saw would have put the one in Nehemiah's day to shame. It was glorious to look at. And yet Jesus wasn't impressed. In fact, he was heartbroken when he saw Jerusalem. He cried out, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing." You see, they can do all the rebuilding they want, and it was right that they did it in Nehemiah's day. But at the end of the day, the problem goes far further than the state of the walls or even of the temple. The problem lies in the hearts of people. Until that is solved, there can be no security, not even in the city of promise, in Jerusalem. Jesus knew this. He knew that the city, for all its grandeur, was nothing but an empty shell. And so Jesus came, not to rebuild a city in the Middle East, but to build a whole new city, the New Jerusalem, and to make a people for himself with new hearts. He came to cleanse his people and invite them into a kingdom that can never be destroyed, and to the New Jerusalem, where there is true security for everyone who is washed by the blood of the Lamb. He did all this by doing what the nobles of Tekoa refused to do. He, the highest king of heaven, stooped and made himself servant of all. He gave his life so that we might have life. He is a king who you can trust. He is a king whose promises you can bank on. He is worth following no matter what it costs you in this life. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the glorious salvation that is offered in Jesus. We thank you that we have such a vivid picture of your people longing for the day when Jerusalem will be made new, when the peoples will flood in from all nations, coming to learn about the God and to come and get to know you, the one who made them, the glorious God of all. Thank you that that is a possibility in Jesus. Thank you that you have redeemed a people for yourself, and that you did it by stooping and making yourself a servant. We thank you for your grace.